Alrighty, folks, welcome to our week 6 discussion here on the Forensics Lab. Do pardon my head cold. I am not feeling so hot, so I'm going to try not to clear my voice or clear my throat here too much during this recording. But thinking back, remember a few weeks ago we talked about a gentleman called Edmond Locard, and I had mentioned that he was the gentleman who had founded the idea of the modern crime lab. Well, here he is, and in 1910 he founded the modern crime lab in Lyon, France. And he was a person who was into microscopes, and he could tell the difference between some hairs and fibers, even the point of like hairs, as in what's a horse hair versus a human hair, what's a head hair from a body hair, etc., and even some differentiations between, a dirty blonde hair like mine from a dirty blonde hair from somebody else. And he was able to make some of those distinctions and show that these could be used in crime scenes. So the French kind of started the idea, and a decade later, we started seeing modern crime labs here in the United States. Now, there were crime labs prior to this. There was some ideas of forensics prior to this, but as we relate to the quote-unquote modern crime lab, the 1920s is where we really saw it. August Vollmer, who is the police chief from Berkeley, California, and instituted a lot of modern police reforms, and we don't have time to talk about all those here in this video recording. But if you're ever interested in reading about a very influential person in policing, August Vollmer is one of those folks. He got recruited in the early 1920s to go down to LA and help the LAPD reform and become more modern. And his friend, Dr. Paul Kirk, who was a chemistry professor up at University of California, Berkeley, was recruited to come down to LA and establish the first modern crime lab in the United States. Incidentally, August Vollmer decided that LAPD just wasn't for him after a couple of years, and he returned back home to the San Francisco area, where he again continued to make some very awesome modern reforms in policing in the early 1900s. Dr. Paul Kirk found that he discovered a love of the forensic sciences, and to this day he is recognized as one of the founders of some of our modern forensic science. As a matter of fact, every year there's an award given out called the Dr. Paul Kirk Award, which has to do with somebody who has done something amazing in forensic science or invented something amazing new in forensic science. Coming forward a little bit, Kelvin Goddard established the first lab in Chicago. Kelvin Goddard was actually a civilian private investigator, and a lot of what he did was involved with the old St. Valentine's Day massacre, where Al Capone had a whole bunch of people dressed as cops using non-police issued firearms and go in and murdered a bunch of rival gang members. And so the Chicago PD was looking really bad there until they were able to prove that no, these weren't police weapons and those were not police uniforms, that they were just imposters. And the FBI kind of caught attention of what was going on in Chicago, and so J. Edgar Hoover sent Charles Apple down to Chicago in the 1930s to find out what was going on there and help establish the first crime lab, the FBI crime lab. This here is actually a photo of room 802 of the railway building, which was the FBI's first crime lab. Look at it's just a couple of tables and some basic equipment. And when you see what the FBI crime lab looks like today, it's just amazing. I mean, the place is huge, bigger than a couple of football stadiums. All right, so I said modern crime lab a couple times. We have about 390 publicly funded crime labs in the United States, and a modern crime lab is one that has at least one full-time scientist on staff. And to be honest, most of our modern crime labs have multiple forensic scientists on staff, and a scientist would be somebody who has a degree in chemistry, biology, or physics. And most of our lab folks have chemistry degrees. When you start dealing with firearms and stuff, you do see some physicists in there. But a lot of your DNA work actually is coming out of chemistry more so than biology. Now, crime lab saw quite a bit of growth, not only the CSI effect, but during different time periods. In the 1960s, we saw a big push into the modern crime lab after the Miranda ruling, and we heard that more and more people were remaining silent because we were telling them, you have the right to remain silent. People have always had that right, but until the Miranda rights came around, that court decision, officers didn't have to tell people about them. We assumed that anybody who graduated, past the grade school, junior high years, they would know what their American rights are. In the 70s and the 80s, we saw a lot of crime labs expansion because of illegal drugs. And the question is, well, is this a baggie of white powdery substance? Is it cocaine or is it baking soda? And then now we're seeing some growth because of the CSI effect. Now, because there is more interest in forensic evidence, we do see quite a bit of backlogging of cases. We are very lucky here in Wisconsin. We don't have technically a backlog, because a backlog is defined as anything where the case has sat at the crime lab for more than 30 days without being analyzed. Now, there are some things that the state of Wisconsin does where we limit the amount of evidence you can send to the crime lab at any one time. Usually 3 to 5 pieces of evidence can only go to the crime lab at one time, but that does cause our backlogs to diminish because we're not sending everything to the crime lab. We're just picking the most important pieces of evidence that have the most likely probative value and sending those off to the crime lab. All right, so some of the different kinds of labs we can have. We have our federal crime labs. So as we said before, the FBI has one of the biggest ones in Quantico, Virginia. They also have 16 regional labs. Don't forget, the Department of Treasury has crime labs. The Secret Service was founded under the Department of the Treasury. Their job originally was not the protection of the president, but protecting against counterfeiting. ATF has a whole bunch of arson labs. Secret Service has a standalone lab from the Department of the Treasury now over in D.C., where they do both some counterfeiting stuff, but then also some of their presidential protection stuff. DEA has quite a few different labs around the country for testing drugs. There's a little known federal agency called the Postal Inspection Service. They handle everything from bombs in the mail to anthrax and stuff like that. They also are a big cybercrime people, because a lot of our identity theft and child pornography and child enticement started in snail mail years ago before the internet. And now all this stuff is happening online. So the Postal Service had to adapt from snail mail to email. And then, Department of Interior, that's, the Park Services, Bureau of Indian Affairs. So they have a lab out there in Oregon. States, each state has their own crime lab system. Every state has a different crime lab system. Here in Wisconsin, our labs are in Wausau, Madison, and Milwaukee. Don't forget that, you can have your local PD lab. So a lot of police departments have small little mini labs. Some of your big cities like New York has a bigger crime lab within the city than the state has at the state level. Don't forget there are private crime labs out there. Some of our private crime labs deal with things such as retail theft. So Target Corporation has their own crime lab. Target does actually help out police departments. This picture down here is actually a picture of Target's crime lab in Minneapolis. And that is the patch collection of all the patches of agencies that they've helped with video forensics. There are also private crime labs that if your attorney, I should say, doesn't believe what the police say, then your attorney can hire an outside consultant to, take a look at the evidence. A lot of our crime labs, basically, they're looking at all the question documents, materials, comparison of fingerprints and DNA. Basically, look at the jobs of our crime lab and personnel. Their first job is the investigation of crimes, taking a trip out to the field to collect evidence. There's not a lot of call for that, but they're also doing the investigations there, basically at the crime lab, where they are taking the information found at the crime scene and they're comparing the fingerprints to what's in the database. So could be investigations out in the field, could be the investigations back at the crime scene. Big part of their job is education. The Wisconsin State Crime Lab does a couple of different classes where you as police officers or as CSIs can go out to the crime lab and take classes. In addition, the crime lab personnel sometimes leave the crime lab and travel out to places like Fox Valley Tech here, the Green Bay Police Department, the Wisconsin State Patrol Academy, and they put on classes to make sure that officers and CSIs know how to do their job and know how to get evidence to the crime lab properly. And don't forget, you're a lifelong learner, so you never stop learning. So folks who work for the crime lab are going to be students, because as new technologies and techniques come out, you have to learn those. Heck, I'm an instructor here at the school. I have a PhD. I'm still going to classes. During Christmas break this last holiday season, I was down in St. Louis taking a class in death investigations and some new updates in how we go about doing some death investigation stuff. So lifelong learning. You gotta like learning to stay in this career path. So some of the sections and responsibilities, usually we see firearms and ballistics as a big section, toxicology, drug analysis, looking at, what's in people's bloods as it relates to drug, and then also unknown chemicals, what bag of white powdery substance is that a drug or not. Our trace evidence, biological and DNA evidence, and then question documents. Trace evidence sometimes does also include the idea of fingerprints. So we have anything from photography to fingerprints, tool mark impressions, tire tracks, the polygraph analysis. Some crime labs do. We don't do polygraph here in Wisconsin, so we don't worry about that too much. And then our crime scene field response unit. Again, in Wisconsin, we don't have a lot of crime scene field response from the crime lab. Other states have quite a bit more. We do have a number of folks at our Wisconsin crime labs, though, who will come out to our crime scenes when we do request them and speed up some of our processing. Now, a couple of issues that, most of our labs, they're busy. And so, if you are asking them for help, they're more than happy to test our evidence, but coming out to your crime scene, it better be important. You don't just ask them to come out to your crime scene for anything. Keep this in mind, though. We can always, send information to the lab, and they can forward it on to other labs, or they can give us information about how to contact other labs. So, like the FBI crime lab, we can work directly with them. It's very easy to work directly from a city police department with the FBI crime lab. If you have an important enough case, you can contact the FBI crime lab, and they will give you some information. Keep in mind, submitting evidence to the lab, sometimes we can mail it through the mail, sometimes we have to hand deliver it. Every piece of evidence, as we go through the semester, you'll learn every piece of evidence goes in its own evidence bag. And basically, our idea is not to send evidence to the lab and tell them do this test on the evidence. Our idea is to send the evidence to the lab, let the lab know what we're looking for, and then have them decide which particular test they're going to use. There's no reason for me to be telling the crime lab to use this particular DNA test on this piece of evidence. That's their job to figure out which DNA test they should be doing. A big issue these days is accreditation. Only about 80% of our crime labs are accredited. There's a lot of stuff that has to go into being accredited. As a matter of fact, this year, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab is going through a reaccreditation and validation process. So our guys down in Madison and Milwaukee and over at Wausau are very busy making sure that all their standards are way up here and not just mediocre. And part of our accreditation, quality control, lab testing protocol, quality assurance as it relates to double-blind testing sometimes, where you're doing proficiency exams where you go in and you give one of your employees a fingerprint, and you know who the fingerprint comes back to, and you want to make sure that they have the test result come back to who they say it should come back to. So even though it's not a real case, you just give them, and they think it's a case, and they bring you back. You basically want to make sure that all your folks who work at the crime lab have some kind of certification, and that then leads to accreditation. All right, certification, wrapping up here. I know we're going fast. We only got about a 15-minute record time on this program I have, and breaking this up into multiple lectures just wasn't really, something that there's any good spots for. The last couple of minutes here, remember, certification is a voluntary process, and not everybody gets certified who goes to work at the crime lab. Usually you get certified after you have your job, so don't be looking for some of these certifications right now while you're a college student. These are certifications that you get after you have the job. As a matter of fact, many of the certifications require that you have a job and have worked for a year or two before you can test for the certification. I would highly suggest seeking out these certifications once you get into a career path. The more certified people you have at your place of employment, the more likely you are to get accreditation. A couple different certifying bodies that are out there. The three ones that are viewed highest. There are other ones out there that, you're kind of wasting your money. But the American Board of Criminalistics, the ABC, very highly respected. The IAI, the International Association of Identification, they certify people both for crime scene work and crime lab work. And the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the AAFS, is one of the biggest certifiers for our crime lab personnel. All three of these organizations we've kind of mentioned before as being organizations, sorry about that you can join. They have student memberships, and these are some of those organizations that put out some pretty cool magazines and journals and newsletters for you to read and keep up on things. All right, so I am down to less than 30 seconds for record time for this video. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, you have your discussion board question for the week, and no additional homework this week. All right, talk to you next week. Bye.